Welcome back, moonlit wanderer. The palace sleeps beneath silver stars, yet the world of stories remains wide awake. Tonight, let us drift alongside Jamal as his thoughts swirl with riddles unsolved and truths unspoken. The moon hung low over the palace courtyard, its pale light glinting off domed rooftops and the copper spires of minarets. Somewhere in the distance, an owl hooted softly, as if asking its own silent riddles to the night. Jamal walked slowly along the balcony corridor, his sandals whispering against cool marble. Below, the courtyard gardens lay in silent perfection. Citrus trees heavy with fruit, their leaves trembling in the gentle desert breeze. Lanterns hung from iron hooks along the colonnades, flickering with small, stubborn flames that pushed back the dark like loyal sentinels. He paused by an open archway to watch the stars. For a moment, he let his mind drift beyond calculations and rivalries, beyond riddles designed to tighten tension around his heart like a noose of words. He remembered when the night sky felt like a promise, not a threat, when he and Al-Nader would sneak out to lie on the palace roof, counting stars until sleep claimed them under the silent gaze of the heavens. A soft cough broke his reverie. Jamal turned to see an old eunuch approaching, his russet robe trailing along the floor. In his wrinkled hands he carried a brass tray with a covered clay cup. "My lord Vizier," he murmured, bowing low. "Mint tea with honey, as you prefer before sleep." Jamal inclined his head with a small smile. "Thank you, Hafiz. You always remember." Hafiz chuckled softly, his missing teeth lending his grin a lopsided charm. "Memory is the final treasure of old age, my lord. All else grows dim, but kindness remains bright." He set the tray upon a small mosaic table near the archway, then shuffled away, leaving Jamal alone with his steaming cup and silent thoughts. He sipped the mint tea slowly, feeling its warmth ease the tightness in his chest. Across the courtyard, a thin ribbon of music rose into the night, a lone oud player rehearsing by lamplight, weaving minor notes that trembled like candle flames in the wind. Jamal closed his eyes, letting the melody cradle him back into memory. He thought of the Sultan's riddle, of Al-Nader's glare, of the falcon's piercing cry that had silenced even the loudest advisors. But beneath these surface thoughts swirled something deeper, a quiet certainty that the true tests of life never came as riddles with neat answers. No, the true tests came disguised as small choices, to speak or remain silent, to forgive or to wound, to build bridges or walls. Each choice, a stroke upon the tapestry of fate. Each choice, a note struck upon the strings of destiny. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of pomegranate blossoms and distant wood smoke. Jamal opened his eyes to watch petals drift down from the shadowed branches above, scattering across the marble like pink-tinted snow. He finished his tea and rose to return to his chamber. The hallway was empty now, lined with brass oil lamps casting soft golden circles upon tiled floors. His footsteps echoed gently, mingling with the faraway laughter spilling from Al-Nadir's private wing, where music still played and goblets still clinked. As he reached his chamber door, Jamal paused and looked back down the corridor, half expecting his brother to appear from the shadows with some new barb disguised as a jest. But the hall remained silent, empty save for the faint creak of cooling beams and the flickering sigh of lamp flames. He entered his chamber. Scrolls lay neatly rolled upon low cedar shelves, and a brass incense burner smoldered with curling trails of sandalwood and myrrh. Jamal set aside his cup and knelt upon his prayer rug, folding his hands quietly in his lap. He bowed his head, murmuring a prayer not for victory or favor, but for wisdom to see truth beneath ambition, to hear love beneath rivalry, to feel peace beneath fear. Outside, the owl hooted again, softer this time, as if in approval. Jamal blew out the final lamp. Darkness wrapped around him like a silken cloak, gentle and absolute. He lay upon his low bed, gazing at the ceiling beams until his eyes grew heavy. In his final waking thought, he saw two small boys lying atop the palace roof, counting stars, sharing whispered dreams of becoming wise men, great builders, beloved sons. For a fleeting moment, envy's shadow lifted from his heart, and in its place glowed a quiet, enduring love for a brother long lost beneath layers of ambition. The night deepened outside his window, cloaking the gardens, domes, and colonnades in its tranquil embrace. Jamal's breathing slowed as sleep overcame him, carrying him into silent dreams of stars reflected upon still desert pools. Jamal woke before dawn, his eyes gritty from too little sleep and too many anxious thoughts chasing each other through the night. He sat up on his thin mattress, rubbing his face with both hands. Outside, the sky was still the deep blue of early pre-dawn, with a single morning star trembling faintly above the rooftops. For a moment, he simply sat there, listening to the quiet drip of water in the courtyard fountain, feeling the cold stone floor beneath his bare feet, and breathing in the faint perfume of jasmine curling in through his lattice window. Today was no ordinary day. Today was the day he would finally present his compiled recommendations on tax restructuring for the river merchants. It sounded dreadfully boring to anyone else, but to Jamal, it was a chance to prove to the Sultan that economic policy could be elegant, stable, and fair. He stood, stretching his arms until his shoulders cracked softly. Then he moved to wash his face in the brass basin, splashing cool rose-scented water over his skin until the last tattered remnants of sleep fled from his mind. He dressed quickly, choosing a robe of dark indigo cotton embroidered along the hems with tiny silver crescents. As he fastened his belt, he glanced at his reflection in the small, polished copper mirror propped against the windowsill. The man who gazed back at him was tired but determined, with dark eyes that still held a flicker of stubborn hope. Despite the weight of constant rivalry pressing against his ribs like a too-tight bandage. In the kitchen hall, servants were already lighting braziers, preparing bread, and slicing dates onto trays. One young boy hurried past him balancing a stack of brass cups taller than his own head, while an old woman stirred a pot of honey and almond porridge, humming under her breath. Jamal took a cup of cardamom coffee from a servant's tray and drank it slowly, feeling the heat and bitterness spread through his chest, waking his mind fully. He left his chambers and made his way through the palace's inner corridors, past marble columns veined with blue and gold, past woven rugs that muffled his footsteps, past guards standing silent and still as carved obsidian statues. The sun had only just begun to rise, sending shafts of pale light slanting through the mashrabia screens, illuminating drifting dust motes like tiny silver insects caught in a sunbeam. When he arrived at the council chamber, Al-Nader was already there. His older brother reclined on a silk cushion, wearing a robe of rich russet embroidered with gold falcons along the sleeves. A faint smirk curved Al-Nader's lips as Jamal entered, as if he had been waiting precisely for this moment to sharpen his tongue. "Up before the rooster crows, little brother?" Al-Nader drawled, sipping his spiced wine from a shallow silver cup. "Careful. They might think you're trying too hard." Jamal ignored him, walking to the long ebony table set before the Viziers' seats. There, stacked neatly, were his scrolls and ledgers, each marked with wax seals of different merchants' guilds. He began sorting them silently, aligning them into the order he would present to the Sultan. His fingers moved quickly but carefully, smoothing each parchment flat with the side of his hand. Still playing the diligent scribe. I see. Al-Nadir continued lazily. You know, brother, there is more to power than knowing how to add numbers and shuffle papers. Yes, Jamal replied, without looking up, his voice quiet and steady. There is also knowing when to stay silent and when to speak wisely. The words hung in the air between them for a moment, taut as a drawn bowstring. Al-Nadir's smile slipped just slightly, his eyes narrowing before he looked away, pretending sudden interest in the flickering lamp beside his cushion. Before the tension could snap into open argument, the chamber doors opened with a hollow boom. 2 guards stepped aside as the Sultan entered, accompanied by his personal scribes and 2 hawk-faced eunuchs in flowing black robes. The Sultan was dressed in pale teal silk with a cloak of peacock feathers draped over his shoulders. His jeweled turban shimmered in the lamplight with sapphires, pearls, and one enormous emerald that glowed like a drop of captured spring. He walked slowly, his gaze sweeping the room without haste. Everyone bowed low. Jamal knelt, forehead nearly touching the cool mosaic tiles, before rising smoothly to stand with his scrolls held in both hands. The Sultan settled onto his sandalwood throne inlaid with ivory flowers, its high arched back carved to resemble a blossoming date palm. He rested his chin on his hand, long fingers tapping his bearded cheek. "Begin," he said, his voice soft but carrying easily through the silent chamber. Jamal stepped forward, unrolling the first scroll to reveal neat rows of elegant black script and red marginalia notes. He spoke clearly, outlining his proposed changes to market taxes, how they would increase revenue without strangling merchants' profits, and how canal toll adjustments could pay for dredging silt from riverbeds without causing upriver villages to collapse into poverty. As he spoke, he felt his confidence settle around his shoulders like a familiar robe, the logic of his plan flowing smoothly from one point to the next. He barely noticed Al-Nadir beside him, watching with narrowed eyes, fingers drumming a restless beat against his cup. Jamal focused instead on the Sultan's gaze, which had sharpened into attentive interest, and on the quiet scribes whose quills flew across their parchment to record every word. Finally, he paused, lowering the scroll and bowing deeply. The Sultan did not speak immediately. He sat back, folding his hands together, and regarded Jamal with a look that was almost thoughtful. Then he shifted his gaze to Al-Nadir. "And what says my other vizier to this proposal?" Al-Nadir smiled smoothly and rose to his feet, brushing imaginary dust from his robe. He stepped forward, clasping his hands behind his back as he spoke. His words flowed with the practiced ease of a man who had spent his life speaking in court, flattering rulers and charming nobles. He praised Jamal's diligence, acknowledged the clarity of his analysis, and then, with surgical precision, began to slide thin, gleaming blades of critique between the plan's seams, highlighting potential anger from camel caravan masters, possible discontent among pearl divers whose levies were tied to market toll rates, and reminding the Sultan that too much mercy and taxation bred complacency among subjects. By the time he finished, the council chamber felt tight with quiet tension. Jamal stood very still, scroll clutched in his hands, while Al-Nadir resumed his seat with the satisfied grace of a lion settling onto warm rocks. The Sultan's gaze moved between them. For a long moment, he said nothing, only tapping his fingers slowly against the throne's carved armrest. Then he leaned forward. "You both speak truth," he said at last. "Jamal, your plan is elegant. Al-Nadir, your caution is wise. I will consider both." He waved his hand in dismissal, a gesture of quiet finality. "Leave me." The Viziers bowed as one, robes brushing the mosaic floor. Together they exited the chamber into the cool, colonnaded hall beyond, their footsteps echoing off stone and tile. Outside, the sun had risen fully, painting the courtyard palms in brilliant gold. Servants hurried past them with baskets of fresh pomegranates and jars of chilled milk. A pair of falcons perched on an iron bar in the shade, tilting their sharp-eyed gaze towards the two brothers as if weighing their worth. Jamal walked with his head held high, scrolls tucked under his arm, refusing to meet his brother's triumphant smirk. Al-Nader said nothing, only walked at his side with a faint curl of satisfaction at the corner of his lips. But deep in Jamal's chest, beneath the churn of disappointment and exhaustion, there burned a quiet, persistent ember of resolve. The day was not yet over, and neither was this war of words. Later that afternoon, Jamal sat alone in his study chamber, elbows propped on his desk, fingers pressing into his temples. Scrolls lay open before him, but the words blurred into tangled ink strokes, meaningless loops and lines. He exhaled slowly, trying to clear his mind, to force his thoughts back into calm, ordered channels. But Al-Nader's cutting words still echoed in his skull like an ill-tuned oud string thrumming endlessly. He looked around his chamber, at the shelves lined with thick leather-bound volumes of jurisprudence, philosophy, riddles, and tax ledgers. On the far wall hung a faded silk tapestry depicting a lone tree in the desert, its roots sinking deep into pale sand as its branches curled skyward toward a golden sun. Jamal often found comfort in its quiet symbolism, survived by rooting deep and growing towards light. But today, even that silent tree felt as weary as he did. A gentle knock came at the doorframe. He turned to see a servant girl entering, balancing a brass tray laden with fresh mint tea, slices of melon chilled in rosewater, and a small dish of honeyed walnuts. She set the tray down before him with careful precision, bowing low. Jamal murmured his thanks, watching as she backed out of the chamber without meeting his eyes. He poured himself a cup of tea, inhaling the sharp, clean scent of mint and cardamom, letting it cut through the heaviness pressing down upon him. As he sipped, he forced himself to consider his next steps. The Sultan's lukewarm dismissal still burned, but it was not a rejection. Not yet. There was still time to prove the worth of his plan. But how? His gaze fell on a half-unrolled scroll beside his elbow, an older economic treatise penned by a long-dead vizier famed for stabilizing market taxes during a drought 2 generations ago. Jamal set down his tea, unrolling the parchment fully, reading each elegant black-lettered line slowly. As he read, ideas began to gather in the dim halls of his mind, coalescing into something sharper, cleaner, stronger. He bent forward, picking up his reed pen and dipping it into his brass inkwell. The pen moved swiftly across fresh parchment, scribbling marginal notes, calculations, merchant impact projections. Outside, the late afternoon sun slanted through his mashrabia screens, laying golden lattice shadows across the tiled floor. Time thinned and dissolved around him as numbers and logistics wove themselves into a fresh pattern. He did not notice when darkness fell, nor when a servant entered silently to light the brass oil lamps lining the room. He wrote on, only pausing when a quiet voice spoke from the doorway. "Little brother," Al-Nader drawled, leaning against the carved cedar frame with studied casualness. "Still scribbling numbers when you should be sleeping?" Jamal did not look up, continuing to write the final line of his new calculations before placing the reed pen aside and raising his gaze calmly. "What do you want, brother?" he asked, keeping his voice even, Al-Nadir pushed away from the doorway, entering the room with slow, unhurried steps. His robes tonight were deep saffron embroidered with teal vines, the sleeves heavy with gold stitching. He picked up a walnut from Jamal's dish and rolled it between his fingers. "Must I want something simply to visit you?" he asked, popping the walnut into his mouth and chewing slowly. "Perhaps I came to see if my diligent brother needed a reminder to rest before he collapses onto his precious scrolls." Jamal regarded him steadily. "Or perhaps you came to gloat?" Al-Nadir smiled, showing white teeth. "Gloat? Over what? The Sultan merely saw wisdom and caution today. I simply spoke what he needed to hear. And tomorrow?" Jamal asked softly. "What if he needs to hear truth instead?" Al-Nadir's smile flickered, then steadied. He turned, wandering to Jamal's shelves, running his fingers lightly over the spines of books and scroll cases. "Truth is a pliable thing, little brother. It bends beneath the weight of power. Perhaps one day you will understand that." He picked up a slim volume of poetry, flipping it open and skimming a few lines before setting it back on the shelf. "Rest well," he said lightly, turning to leave. "You will need your strength when the Sultan calls council again." When he had gone, the chamber seemed to grow larger and emptier around Jamal. The lamps flickered softly, casting wavering gold light across his weary face. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling beams where tiny spiders spun their silent silver threads between carved floral motifs. For a long time he sat there, unmoving, breathing in the mingled scents of mint, ink, and oil flame. Then, slowly, he gathered his scrolls and rose from his chair. He walked to the small alcove in the corner of his study where a woven prayer rug lay spread beneath a brass lamp bracket. Kneeling upon it, he bowed low, pressing his forehead to the soft wool. He prayed silently, not for victory over his brother, nor for power or recognition, but for clarity of mind, for strength of heart, and for mercy upon those whose lives would be shaped by the decisions he made in these chambers of polished stone and silent echoes. When he rose, a thin resolve had settled over him like a fresh robe. He extinguished the lamps one by one, plunging the room into darkness lit only by the silver glow of moonlight seeping through the lattice screens. Gathering his scrolls to his chest, he crossed to his sleeping mat, lay down, and closed his eyes. Outside, the palace lay quiet under the moon's watchful gaze. The city beyond slept in fits and starts, dogs barking in distant alleys, merchants snoring under awnings, the river sighing against its stone banks. But within one chamber of books and shadowed lamplight, a quiet mind dreamed of better ways to weave justice into gold. The next morning dawned pale and cool, a thin veil of mist drifting through the palace courtyards. Jamal rose before the first call to prayer, washed with chilled rosewater from a brass basin, and wrapped himself in a fresh robe of muted indigo, trimmed with saffron stitching. He felt the weight of the coming day settle across his shoulders like an invisible mantle. He left his chamber quietly, walking barefoot along the tiled corridor towards the eastern colonnade, where dawn light spilled between carved stone pillars. There he paused, taking in the sight of the palace gardens below, rows of flowering pomegranate bushes, fig trees heavy with ripening fruit, neat squares of herbs bordered by lavender hedges. Servants moved silently among the beds, gathering mint and basil into wicker baskets for the kitchens. Jamal's gaze drifted upwards to the distant city walls, beyond which the desert stretched in rolling ochre dunes beneath a sky still streaked with lavender and pearl. Somewhere out there, caravans crawled slowly towards Baghdad, bearing sacks of saffron and barrels of date wine, guarded by thin men with sharper swords than pay. He turned away and continued down the colonnade, sandals slapping softly against the smooth stone. At the end of the hall, 2 guards in black, lacquered armor flanked a heavy cedar door inlaid with mother-of-pearl. One bowed and pushed it open, revealing the grand council chamber within. The room was already half full. Viziers in robes of russet, teal, and saffron clustered along low-cushioned benches. Scribes in pale linen sat cross-legged beside their brass ink pots, and merchant petitioners waited nervously near the far wall, fingering prayer beads or wringing sweat-dampened turbans. At the head of the room stood Al-Nadir, gesturing expansively as he addressed a group of minor advisors. His robe today was a deep emerald, embroidered with gold falcon motifs along the hem. Jamal moved to his customary seat without a word, unrolling a fresh scroll and laying it before him. He caught brief snippets of Al-Nadir's speech, proposals for increasing tariffs on river barge imports, suggestions for expanding the palace granaries, a casually dismissive comment about reassigning half the treasury scribes to temple tax audits. Jamal felt his jaw tighten, but forced himself to remain silent. At length, the chamberlain entered with his long carved staff, striking its iron tip 3 times against the marble floor. The room fell silent instantly. Then the Sultan himself entered, flanked by 2 towering eunuch guards and a slender young boy carrying his carved ivory coffee cup. The ruler wore a simple white robe, belted with a thin gold chain, and upon his head rested a turban wound in shimmering indigo silk. He seated himself upon the broad cedar throne inlaid with turquoise and jet, gesturing lazily for the proceedings to begin. The first petitioner, an elderly date farmer with stooped shoulders and roughened hands, stepped forward. He bowed deeply, pressing his forehead to the floor before raising himself on creaking knees. "Honored Sultan," he croaked, voice quivering with age and fear. "My groves near the Western Canal are dying. The irrigation channels are clogged with silt from last month's storms. If they are not dredged soon, the palms will wither, and my family will starve." The Sultan said nothing, merely flicking his fingers towards Al-Nadir. The vizier stepped forward with a small, mirthless smile. "We thank you for your diligence," Al-Nadir said smoothly. "However, funds are limited this month. Perhaps next season, when trade tax revenues are stronger." The old man's eyes welled with tears. He clasped his hands together, trembling. "Please, noble vizier, there will be no next season if the palms die. The date harvest feeds half our village." Jamal rose quietly to his feet. The chamber stilled as his voice, calm and even, filled the silence. "My Lord Sultan," he said, bowing slightly before turning to the throne. "If I may propose an alternative." The Sultan inclined his head almost imperceptibly. Jamal continued, "Rather than wait for new revenues, we might redirect a small portion of the surplus allocated for river barrel inspections this month, only 10%, to fund the immediate dredging of these canals. In turn, the date harvest will stabilize local market prices, ensuring greater tax yields by winter. It is a modest investment that promises a stronger return before year's end." He fell silent. The old farmer looked up at him with silent gratitude, shining in his rheumy eyes. Al-Nadir's lips pressed into a thin line, his fingers curling around the gold-threaded sash at his waist. The Sultan leaned back slightly on his throne, studying Jamal with those unfathomable dark eyes. Then he raised his hand in a dismissive wave. "Let it be so," he murmured. "Do as Jamal suggests." The farmer sagged with relief, bowing again and again until 2 scribes guided him gently aside. Jamal sat down, exhaling softly. He could feel Al-Nadir's glare prickling across his cheek like desert thorns, but he refused to meet his brother's eyes. The next petitioner approached, a merchant from Basra complaining of pirates along the coastal trade routes. Jamal listened intently as al-Nadir made sweeping promises of naval patrol expansions, calculated solely to impress the watching nobles without offering any realistic funding solutions. When the merchant left, brow furrowed and steps uncertain, Jamal made a quiet note upon his scroll. Investigate possibility of merchant consortium-led escort fund, potential to stabilize port revenues by spring. And so the morning passed. A tide of petitions and dismissals, each wave eroding a little more of Jamal's patience, with his brother's arrogant disregard. By midday, the chamber began to empty, courtiers drifting out to shaded porticos for melon slices and cool rosewater drinks. Jamal remained at his bench long after the last petitioner had left, carefully rolling up his scrolls and tying each with its colored silk ribbon. At length he rose, gathering the documents to his chest, and walked from the silent hall out into the sunlit courtyard beyond. There he paused, raising his face to the pale autumn sky, feeling the sun's warmth soak through his robes into his weary bones. A thin breeze rustled the date palms overhead, scattering tiny golden fronds across the marble tiles. He closed his eyes for a moment, breathing in the mingled scents of fig trees, ink and sandalwood drifting from nearby chambers. Then he opened them again, shoulders squaring as he turned towards his next task. For today, as every day, the kingdom continued to spin upon its silent axis, balanced between greed and wisdom, cruelty and mercy. And he, Jamal, would remain its quiet counterweight, no matter how often the fulcrum shifted beneath his feet. That evening, after the sun had dipped below the palace domes and the sky lay drenched in indigo, Jamal sat in his private chamber, quietly reviewing the day's scrolls by lamplight. Outside his latticed windows, the hum of the city softened into night. Faint calls of water sellers closing their stalls, the muted clang of the last temple bells, distant children's laughter fading into the alley shadows. A servant entered carrying a brass tray laden with roasted lamb in saffron sauce, small bowls of pickled lemons, and a steaming jug of mint tea. She set it before him silently, bowing low before withdrawing into the outer hall. Jamal poured himself a cup, inhaling the bright herbal vapor, and sipped thoughtfully. He set the cup down, unrolled a fresh parchment, and began drafting notes for the next council session. His handwriting was elegant and angled, each stroke placed with deliberate care. Proposal: merchant-led naval escort fund. Cost analysis: minimal treasury outlay. Potential to decrease pirate toll bribes by 40%. Halfway down the parchment, he paused, eyes drifting across the lamplit shadows. Despite exhaustion prickling behind his temples, his mind would not quiet. It paced restlessly within him like a caged desert cat. He thought of the old date farmer, of the stooped shoulders straightening in hope. He thought of al-Nadir's curling lip as the Sultan approved Jamal's proposal without a second thought for his brother's pompous orations. And he thought, too, of their father, long buried beneath a carved marble slab in the palace gardens, beneath flowering jasmine vines. Their father who had taught them both to read by oil lamp glow, who had thrashed them equally with a reed cane for careless sums or sloppy calligraphy, who had taught them that wisdom wielded without kindness was as dangerous as any blade. He closed his eyes briefly, pressing fingers to his brow. The memory of his father's deep, calm voice seemed to linger in the hush of the chamber. Serve the people, Jamal, not just the throne. The lamp beside him guttered briefly in a stray breeze, shadows waltzing across the geometric tile work. He rose to adjust the glass chimney, steadying the flickering flame. Beyond his window, the courtyard braziers burned low, their coals glowing like scattered rubies beneath the whispering palms. He turned back to his scroll, read his last line, and dipped his reed pen once more. Another note, another calculation, another quiet fortification laid to protect his people against careless decrees and boastful illusions. Then came a quiet knock at his chamber door. He looked up sharply. Few disturbed him at this hour. He set down the pen, rose, and moved to unlatch the carved teak panels. Outside stood his brother. Al-Nadir filled the doorway in a wash of saffron-scented night breeze. He wore a dark teal robe embroidered with silver crescents, his beard freshly oiled and gleaming. His eyes glittered in the lamplight, narrowed with an expression that Jamal had known since childhood, part disdain, part curiosity, and part something unreadable, coiled like a serpent in the shadows. "Brother," Jamal said softly, stepping aside to allow him entry. Al-Nadir moved into the chamber with a rustle of heavy fabric, his fingers brushing lightly over a stack of scrolls as he passed. "Still reading your dusty riddles by lamplight?" he asked, voice heavy with mocking warmth. "Still ignoring them by moonlight?" Jamal replied without malice. Closing the door behind him, Al-Nadir let out a low laugh, sinking gracefully onto a cushioned divan near the far wall. He plucked a single almond from Jamal's supper tray, rolling it between his thumb and forefinger. "I saw the old date farmer leave the council with tears in his eyes," he said after a moment. "Your pity will drain the treasury dry one day." "It was not pity," Jamal replied calmly, returning to his bench. "It was investment. Without dates in the markets, tax prices collapse. Without tax, no palace renovations, no new ivory mirrors for your chamber." Al-Nadir snorted, popping the almond into his mouth and chewing thoughtfully. "Ever the merchant's son, counting coins before compassion." Jamal studied him for a moment, tilting his head. "And you, ever the peacock, fanning feathers before understanding why you strut?" They locked gazes across the flickering lamplight, silence thickening between them until it felt almost solid. At last, Al-Nadir rose, smoothing his robe. "I came," he said quietly, "because tomorrow the Sultan intends to summon us both at dawn. There is talk of new appointments in the southern provinces. Perhaps he seeks to divide our power." Jamal felt a cold knot form in his belly. "Or perhaps," he replied softly, "he seeks to test which of us he trusts more to govern alone." Al-Nadir's jaw tensed. For a heartbeat, his mask of amused superiority slipped, revealing a flicker of fear. Then it hardened again into disdain. "I will not be exiled to the southern provinces like a discarded steward," he snapped. "Remember that, little brother." Without waiting for an answer, he turned and strode from the chamber, his robes trailing after him like shadows fleeing dawn. Jamal remained still, listening to his brother's footsteps fade along the tiled corridor. He turned back to his scroll, dipped the reed pen, and wrote a final line beneath his neat columns of calculations. "When the falcon fights the falconer, only the desert winds rejoice." He blotted the ink, rolled the parchment, and tied it with a strip of russet silk. Outside, the night deepened into true darkness, stars winking to life above the domed roofs like pale sentinels. Jamal extinguished the lamp and moved to his narrow sleeping couch, lowering himself onto the cool linen sheets. He lay there in silence, staring up at the carved cedar beams overhead, the words of his father echoing softly in his chest. Somewhere beyond the palace walls, the desert winds blew free across moonlit dunes, indifferent to kings, viziers, or whispered threats spoken in the shadows of power. And as his eyes drifted closed, sleep crept upon him like a patient scribe, laying its quiet, inevitable script across his weary mind. Thank you for listening to this quiet chapter under the gaze of moon and stars. May your sleep tonight be calm, your dreams filled with gentle truths, and your heart awaken tomorrow, light and unburdened. Sleep well, dear friend.